All right, so starting with this first graph, we have to graph y equals 2 sine x minus 1. Now the minus 1 is down 1. I'll talk about how to address that in a minute. Let's fill out some of the stuff on the top. So the amplitude is 2. It's the absolute value of the a value. Period is 2 pi over b. b is 1 because that's in front of the x. So the period is 2 pi. The number of periods on this interval, negative 4 pi to 4 pi. So you can either get this after graphing, count how many periods you have, or what this is asking is like, here's a distance. 4 pi minus negative 4 pi is a distance of 8 pi units across here. How many times does 2 pi fit into that? So divide that by 2 pi and you get 4. So we should see 4 full sine curves as we get done with this. All right, now how do we graph this thing? So first I take the period and I mark off where it is. So it's at 2 pi. And when we graph these sine curves, the sine curve looks like this, right? So if you look at that, the last point is at 2 pi, the middle point is at pi, and then there's a point halfway between each of those. So I like to put little tick marks here. I'm going to have the middle point at pi, cut that in half, cut between pi and 2 pi in half. So you've got tick marks at each of these. And normally the sine graph is going to be at 0, go up to its amplitude 2, 0, negative 2, 0, right? We've got to shift this down 1. So either take those points and shift them all down 1. Or another thing I like to do is I like to draw in what I call the midline. And midline is the midline is at y equals negative 1 because of the shift down 1. This is a concept we're going to use a little bit later in the chapter, so it's kind of nice to get familiar with like what is the midline. So the midline is represented by the vertical shift, and it just tells you where these 3 points in the middle of the graph, where they're going to get shifted to, where they should land. So sometimes instead of drawing the original like ghost points, if you want to call them that, I draw in the midline after I've divvied up the period. And I say, okay, normally I start at 0, 0. So the new 0, 0 is like on my midline. So I start the sine graph here. I go up 2 units to its amplitude. So I should be at 1. Back to 0, which is on my midline. 2 units below my midline. And back to the midline. So this is one period of the sine curve with an amplitude 2, and it's been shifted down 1. And then what do I do to get this to keep going? I just keep going. If you look at the period, we've got 1 point plotted every one box. So just keep up with the pattern. 2 units above the midline, midline, 2 units below, midline. Here's 2 full periods of that sine curve, and continue it on. So from here we go down 2 units below the midline, 2 units above, 2 units below. Here's another period. Again, down, midline, up, midline, like that. That is 4 periods. You can count them after the fact of your sine curve that fits within this interval. Okay, let's do another one. So what's the amplitude? Even though it's a negative 1, remember amplitude is absolute value of a. So the amplitude is 1. The period is 2 pi divided by b, which is just 2 pi. And how many periods are going to fit? We did this before. 8 pi divided by the period. This distance divided by the length of the period tells you we should get 4 of these cosine curves in. So what about the negative? The negative is an x-axis reflection. Here's how I think of that. Cosine, I always remember, just basically starts at the number on the y-axis at the number in front of it. So if it's got a negative 1 in front, it's going to start at negative 1. Then it hits the midline. Then it goes up to 1, midline, down. So this is a negative cosine x curve. What about the plus 2? That is up 2. But you could also say, oh, so the midline is going to go through y equals 2. So let's divvy up the period first. The graph should end at 2 pi for the first period. Cut that in half, cut that in half, cut the last part in half. So I'm going to have points every box again. I'm going to draw in my midline of y equals 2. And so using the midline, that's going to shift the graph up for me. What do we say about the cosine graph? So it starts out at -1 normally, or another way to think of that is it starts out 1 unit below its midline if it's negative cosine, and then it hits the midline, and then it's 1 unit above, midline, 1 unit below. So here's one period of the cosine curve. And then we just repeat that pattern because these are periodic functions, and we know that they have the same pattern across an interval of input values. You just keep on going. We're supposed to do this across from -4 pi to 4 pi. So I just kept going with all of my points here. You can do them one period at a time. It's kind of up to you. Make sure your arrows curve back up because the graph doesn't go down from here. It's got a max and a min. All right, no vertical shift for this one, but there is a change in period. So the amplitude is 3. The period is 2 pi divided by 1/2, which is 2 pi times 2. So that's 4 pi. And then how many periods fit if the period is 4 pi? So this is still 8 pi, that distance, 4 pi minus -4 pi. How many times does 4 pi fit into that? Only twice. So we should only see 2 full periods of the sine curve here. No horizontal shift, so the midline is just y equals 0. You don't have to write that down. I'm not going to sketch that in. That's the x-axis. And there's no vertical shift, there's no reflection to think about either. So again, in my head, I've got the sine graph looks like this. This is the general shape you've got to have memorized for your sine graph. So what about the period? Mark off where 4 pi is. Mark off halfway between 0 and 4 pi, so at 2 pi. Mark off halfway between that, so tick mark at pi. And then keep that same distance, so we mark at 3 pi. So everywhere I've placed a mark is where I'm going to place one of my points. So the sine graph starts at 0. At the next tick mark, which is pi, it hits the amplitude, which is 3. Back to the midline at 2 pi. 3 below the midline at 3 pi. And then back to 4 pi. So here is our vertically stretched and horizontally stretched sine curve. And then we repeat that process over here. So I like to see the tick marks on my paper. Otherwise, it's easy for me to accidentally place the point in the wrong spot. And you can start from the left too. You can start over and say, okay, at -4, I'm going to be 0. At -3 pi, I'm going to be 3. Then I'm at the midline again at -2 pi, and then I'm 3 units below. As long as you get the points placed in the right spot, you can go left to right or right to left. All right. Again, no vertical shift for this one. So amplitude is 2. No reflection to think about there. Cosine is 2 pi over 2. So that means the period is pi. So we're going to have to jam the cosine curve into pi units. So how many periods are going to fit within 8 pi if each period is pi units? We're going to get 8 periods of the cosine graph. All right, so mark off where pi is. That's the end of the cosine graph. Halfway is at pi over 2. What's halfway here? This is pi over 4. And halfway between pi over 2 and pi is 3 pi over 4. Or you can count, right? 1 pi over 4, 2 pi over 4, 3 pi over 4. Do I have to label? I'm not going to label every tick mark across, but it's nice to label the first 2. Our AP test will not be asking us to graph by hand necessarily, but they might be asking us to label where these points are. So it's good to be able to graph by hand so that you can do all the stuff that they're going to ask of us later. All right, the cosine graph starts at its amplitude, hits the midline, below midline, midline, above midline. So the amplitude here is 2. Start at 2 on the y-axis. At pi over 4, hit the midline. At pi over 2, you should be at -2. At 3 pi over 4, midline. At pi, 2. Here's one period of this cosine graph, which has undergone a horizontal shrink. Now, I'm not going to label everything, but I am going to divvy up and do just one period at a time because I don't want to get it messed up. So here's the next period. Should end at 2 pi. Then your next one will end at 3 pi, so cut that distance in half. So every point is being placed like a half box, I guess you could say. Remember, we said we're going to get 8 of these periods in, so here's the last one on this side. And because these are periodic, we don't have to put too much thought into the other points. As long as we have that first period graphed correctly, we're good. So negative pi, cut that into fourths, and just continue on. There's that graph, negative 2 pi, divvy that up into fourths. I always do half and then half. Your curves don't have to be perfect, but try to put a little bit of neatness to them. Like, yes, you have the points plotted, but you don't want to just like do something like that. So make sure that you're trying your best to make these smooth curves and hit these points. And we've got that. Okay, 8 periods of that graph on this interval. Back to another vertical shift. So let's take a look at this. All right, so what's the amplitude? It's the absolute value of negative 2. So it's 2. I like to make a note to myself that it's a reflection of the sine graph. Or sometimes what I also do is just remind myself that, like, this is what negative sine looks like. Negative sine from 0, 0 goes down instead of up. The plus 2 is going to be my midline. There's a midline at y equals 2. The period is 2 pi divided by 1. And so how many periods are going to fit? 8 pi divided by 2 pi. We should get back to 4 periods. So I'm going to divvy up the 2 pi first. And then I'm going to draw in my midline of 2. Again, drawing the midline is optional. I just like to have it in there. And then the sine graph, looking at my little reference over here, it starts on the midline. It's got an amplitude of 2, so it should be 2 units below midline, which puts me right on the x-axis. Then midline, 2 units above the amplitude, I'm up to 4. Midline. So here's one period of that sine curve. Divvy up the next period and continue the pattern. So back to 2 units below midline, midline, 2 above, midline. And we do the same thing on the left. So from here, the next point should be 2 units above midline, midline, 2 below, midline. Maybe the last one I start on the far left, midline, 2 below, midline, up. So you can come at this from the left or the right. Just make sure you put arrows on either end. These graphs do go on forever. Remember, we're just looking at this window here. All right, what about this one? 4 cosine of 2x. So amplitude's 4. Period is 2 pi divided by 2. Oh, so we're back to that period of pi, which means we're going to get 8 periods on this again. My goodness. Okay, and now the amplitude's 4. So cosine starts at the amplitude, midline, below, midline, above. All right, so divvy up pi. And now if you want to, you can divvy up the whole thing. You can start doing all this and just go crazy. You might as well for our last one, right? Let's just see if we can do this all at once just to make it fun. Let's just do it on the positive side. So the cosine graph starts at 4, then midline, then negative 4. At pi, I'm at midline. Oh, no, wait. See, I just skipped one just to make it fun. Okay, sorry. Hold on. I skipped over a point. Okay, cosine starts at 4. At pi over 4, I should be at midline. At pi over 2, I should be at 4, and then midline, and then 4. Maybe it's a bad idea to do them all at once. Let's see if I can do the next one. Midline, 3 pi over 2 is down here, and then midline, and then up. Midline, below, midline, above. Midline, below, midline, above. Let's sketch that in. These are very hard to sketch and not make them look just really ugly, so I'm going a bit wide, I think, when I'm sketching these. I'm trying to give smooth curves, rounded, trying to get through my points. It doesn't have to be perfect, but just try not to make it super sloppy. Same thing on the left side. So let's divvy this all up. So every half unit, we should be plotting a point. I use the tick marks so that my eye has something to see when I'm plotting points. If I don't mark that off, I'm going to skip over something. And I'm going to start on the far left just to copy what's going on. So at negative 4 pi, I should be above at 4. And then midline, below, midline, above. That's negative 3 pi. Midline, below, midline, above, midline, below, midline, above, midline, below, midline, above I already have. It's a good sign when your graph meets up with the portion that you already graphed. When I'm sketching these in, I have found that it's always easier to draw dragging your pencil down instead of trying to make it go up. I feel like an art teacher told me that one time, so pass that on to you. You can see how I'm making my curves. All right, that's it for this worksheet. Graphing just takes a lot of practice, but hopefully this kind of helped. Come see me for office hours if you want more practice.